we're going to start with that, the whole Ukraine situation. John, this is a story about propaganda and the Russians' use of propaganda. What do you think? There's propaganda going on this side as well?
Oh, I mean, the thing is, it's very hard to get through the fog of propaganda. Everything's painted in this black and white, good or bad image. You know, I thought the funny thing about that article was, you know, correspondents in Russia upset about media bias over there. Well, I forget who said it, but somebody once said the truth is the first casualty of war. And you know, for people who work for the British media to be upset about bias is a bit ironic. And the unfortunate thing about the propaganda war, as I say, it's painted as black and white, and if you try to plough a somewhat sensible path through it, then you're a conspiracy nut. I mean, I've listened to some great alternative media, and it's always important with things like this to track it back over the years. This didn't just happen last week. You know, when and I said it last week, I think that when the Iron Curtain came down, it was the end of history. Everything was going to be brilliant from now on. And look how it ended. And hidden behind all this propaganda is the truth. Yeltsin did a deal with Bill Clinton that he would ensure that Putin became his successor. This is in state papers that have been discovered. And Putin was supposed to be the West's puppet. And it's just this meddling in other countries' affairs, from particularly US imperialism, but Western imperialism as well, that's led to this. And there was, I think it was in 2014, a leaked discussion from somebody in the US State Department discussing who should be the next president of Ukraine and how they had to stop Klitschko, the boxer, becoming it. And so they thought, again, you know, it's a puppet regime. And no, you know, I'm as confused as anybody. There are neo-fascists in the Ukraine government. There are neo-fascists organized within its army. And so all this is mangled up. And I'm not defending what's happened. We have to condemn the invasion of another country by a foreign power. But we also have to worry about the ongoing consequences. I'm worried about the ban on Russia Today, because where does that finish? Does this show get cancelled? You know, I enjoy some of the things on Russia Today. I've been interviewed on it. So I suppose that makes me a Putin friend in people's eyes. But when I was first suspended from the Labour Party, there was only Russia Today that took any interest and give me a great interview. And it does some good programs. The Kaiser Report by Max Kaiser, that, you know, dissembles the world capitalist system. So we've got to be very careful, because, you know, closing down, the government some years back closed down Press UK as a television program. Now, I've never seen that. I don't know its content. But this cancel culture now is in the highest echelons of power, and we have to fight that. But we always have to, as I say, track it back to what led up to this. And if the West had never interfered, who knows? We might be in a better situation.
Okay, well, look, I've got to move on because we've got lots of stuff. Thanks, John. Jackie, this story is on the front page of the Morning Star. The time is to help is now. As refugees flee from Ukraine, Britain has to offer more, warn human rights groups. What do you think about the refugee crisis? Have you followed what's been happening with people fleeing from Ukraine?
Well, I'm going to have to, I'm sorry, I know you're in a rush, but I'm going to have to develop what I'm going to have to say. I'm going to have, and I'll be very quick on my next one. Okay. Because, no, really, because what I'm going to say is the interesting way in which refugees are treated. You know, if they come from the Ukraine and they're white, there are people clamoring to have them in. If they come from Hong Kong and they suit our political interests, we're actually welcoming them in and sponsoring them in. And there is such a racism behind not just the way this is being reported, but the whole actions of white, European, NATO backing states. And I'll give you an example. You know, at the moment, something like 63% of people in the UK are supporting refugees from the Ukraine coming in. 50% of people in the UK don't even know that there's a war going on in Yemen, even though last night US and British armed Saudi troops were bombing Yemen, where there is a total famine and crisis going on. Now let's just see what's also happening, the way this is being reported. It's not a surprise, although the irony is just extraordinary, that in Israel, the streets are with people backing the Ukrainians, and they're actually protesting against people making foreign incursions on other people's lands. I mean, the irony there is extraordinary. We're having British television watching Ukrainian women taken to the streets to make Molotov cocktails. And when that was happening in Gaza, just think how those people were being called terrorists. And when people tell me, well, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. Actually, let me just remind you, when it was white people who were actually being refugees, white Africans, we were all welcoming them and saying how awful it was. And I'm just going to say some more things about the way that race endorses the superstructures of global power of the white world. And we have that embedded in all our subconsciouses. I've noticed it on the left and I've noticed it on the right. And I'd like to put this into chat at some point. The BBC, I think it was yesterday, were interviewing somebody from the Ukraine. And what he kept saying was, I had to watch, I mean, it's extraordinary, he said, European, blue-eyed, blonde-haired children going under threat of war, right? But that's not even the worst of it, because when this man said this, and I'm quoting here the BBC interviewer, he responded by saying, I understand and respect your emotion. I understand and respect your emotion, which was actually pure, utter racism. Some of you on social media may have also seen the most disgusting scenes of African people who were studying in the Ukraine with their families being turned off and away from trains trying to escape. And they were being told repeatedly, you don't get to go on. So don't give me that stuff about how we're supporting people and this is all about anti-racism. What actually lies and reinforces our actions and the differential way we treat these stories is the fallacy of race. And I'm ashamed that so many people on the left are not thinking about it in that way. I'm particularly ashamed that so many of our left leaders have been silent on this issue.
Thank you, Jackie. I mean, I did notice the story about the students, the African students, not being getting onto the trains. It's not really broken in the mainstream. John, our next story is about sanctions, and how we're going to pull down the Russians with sanctions. How much money have they already got in different pots here? It's incredible what they've managed to achieve since the wall came down. I mean, where did they get all their money in the first place? It's just a murky world, isn't it? What's happening with those Russian oligarchs? I think you're muted. Sorry. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, London became the money laundering for people from the former Soviet Union in particular. And let's remember, their money is stolen state assets. You know, people like Abramovich, who gets a mention, who was just happens to have handed Chelsea over to some trust, pillowing the former nationalised oil companies. You know, it was a free-for-all for this gangster capitalism. We've had, you know, a prime minister who, if you're the wife of a Russian oligarch, you can pay £160,000 for a game of tennis. You know, that's more than some professional players get for playing. And they've actually delayed these sanctions to give people time to move their money.
Yeah.
And to say that it's some sort of victory for Johnson is absolute crap. The man is in this up to his eyes. And let's never forget, when they wanted to seize Venezuela's assets, they did. And we're still refusing to hand them back. I read a very interesting point about, there's a hill, I forget what it's called in London, where the diggers first took action and proclaimed it common land. It's now a Russian gated, walled enclave full of empty houses. And the tragedy in Britain with such mass homelessness and all these empty houses just stood empty in London because it's people money laundering. And I think that, you know, we have to, this is capitalism, this is neoliberalism on steroids, and sanctions. I mean, what's he going to do? You know, these people are rich beyond our imagination. Not all the money is here. I'm not suggesting we take even more drastic action that can escalate into things, but to pretend that Britain is fighting on the side of the Ukrainian government is absolutely disgusting. The Tories have taken at least £2 million from Russian oligarchs, and we think they're going to seize their assets, you know, pull the other one. It's part of this propaganda war that, you know, we're being told a certain line, we're being spoon-fed that, look, we're taking action. You know, what will it do for the people of Ukraine who are fighting, you know, with Molotov cocktails, with handmade weapons, who are in the street? What will it do if we just seize Roman Abramovich's football club? Absolutely nothing.
Well, so it's a sort of tokenism that they're just trying to make out they're doing something.
Yeah, the bare minimum to appear that you're doing something. Yeah. And, you know, it's like the pandemic. The Tories did the bare minimum to appear that they were doing something all the time. It was sending the elderly back into homes to die. So,
right, well, we've got to move on. Jackie, the last story is Abramovich's daughter's been on an anti-war protest in Russia. We seem to be quite keen on these protests against war in Russia, but when the media sees them here, we don't really get that. I mean, we didn't get big media coverage when people were going to bomb Syria or bomb Iraq. So what do you think about this coverage of the protests?
Well, I'm more interested in the way that young people protesting are being lauded in Russia, especially on a week when Starmer actually shut down the democratically elected youth wing of the Labour Party. So what we're having is, if you're the young child of a multi-billionaire and you're protesting in Russia, then what you need to hear is listen to the youth voice. But if you're in the Labour Party, then what you do is you shut it down, because what they called it the voice of the youth, detrimental to Labour views. Well, that's really a real Politburo view coming there. And of course, David Lammy, he actually waded in on this and said how ridiculous it was to have people of that age thinking that they could possibly step in and discuss politics. And this is a man who I think went into Parliament 3 or 4 years after he got out of university. I mean, the man is just a sham. He's not actually even an Uncle Tom, you know, because an Uncle Tom would just support the masters all the time. What Lammy does is support himself all the actual time. And then I just want to finish off with this one thought. One of our youngest MPs, in fact, one of our best MPs, Zara Sultana, had some vicious death threats made against her. And now I totally despair at the response of the Socialist Campaign Group. And I think they have just discredited themselves so much. I don't think they're any more credible to be our leaders. But she is one of the youngest MPs and certainly the most radical. And what she did, and this hasn't been really highlighted, she didn't just complain about the threats, but she actually sent a letter to the chair of the Labour Party talking about the hate campaign that she feels has been directed at her because of the hate speech of the Labour leadership about the stance she took when she signed the letter. Well, of course, she should never have bloody taken her signature off, and nor should the rest of them either. But even so, this is our dual standards. And I'm just ashamed of our parliamentary party, the whole lock, stock and barrel of them.
Well, thank you both